their main agenda is to sow doubt. It's a very Russian playbook, to sow doubt and to sort of claim that it's a sort of Mossad, CIA operation. I have to say, and I'll tell you this, and I think it's quite interesting that a lot of Iranians, obviously within or outside the country, do not buy this. They claim to have arrested 20,000 Mossad agents after the Iran-Israeli war. If there are still Mossad agents running around Iran, they haven't been doing a very good job. I mean, this is they're coming out with some quite freakish arguments to claim that they have not been involved in the killing of protesters. Nobody buys it. And it's only, I'm sorry to say, the useful idiots abroad that are sort of basically showing a certain amount of reception to these arguments. You've got to be very, very careful.
Iranians are demanding help to put an end to 4.5 decades of Islamist rule under the Ayatollahs. But burned by other disasters in the Middle East, the West seems to be dragging its heels. It's the US and UK so-called meddling in Iran that's often blamed for the country's instability. They say their support for the Shah provoked a backlash. But were they wrong? Looking at how the narrative over the brutal protest crackdown is being spun in real time, it's only right we revisit the fall of the Shah and the Islamic Revolution. And history might teach us that with a little bit of help in 1979, the Islamic Republic might have been avoided. To discuss, Professor in Modern History Ali Ansari joins me now. So Ali, thank you so much for joining me. Reuters are reporting today that the protests are starting to die down a little bit due to the regime's brutal crackdown. Do you think it will be possible for the Iranians to overthrow the regime without outside help?
It's vitally important that the people inside the country see that there is support and help from outside. Now, what quite that support and help would be is a matter for others to discuss. I mean, we've got a whole range of options there. I think what would be very bad for the people in Iran is for Trump to have said, we are there, we are with you, we are coming to help you, and then do absolutely nothing. I mean, that would not go down terribly well at all, and would be very dispiriting to the people in Iran. It is true, and I think you're quite right to say that the demonstrations are dying down. I mean, it's not surprising, really, given the level of the slaughter that's taken place, and it really has been unprecedented in modern Iranian history. And when I mean modern Iranian history, I mean probably the last 150 years. So it's not a it's a pretty it's a pretty striking experience in that sense, and I think a lot of people are absorbing the shock. But there's also it's quite clear from what evidence we can get is that the anger, the rage, the fury at the regime is still there, and I don't think this is over by a long shot. Actually, I mean it's the fact that they're keeping the internet and the blackout for 2 weeks or so is an indication that they don't think it's over either.
And if we bring it to the politics here about intervention, there seems to be a reluctance because there's a big narrative around the 1953 coup. Could you tell the viewers a little bit about what happened there and whether we're right to have this reluctance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that in the sort of the popular historical sort of imagination, both in Iran, but less so in Iran actually, but more in the West. Obviously, we have this sort of rather sorry experience of the British and Americans getting involved in overthrowing the nationalist prime minister, the Shah, in 1953 during the oil nationalisation crisis, and it's really part of the it's part of almost the identity of any activist Iranian today. It's not as much part of the landscape of the Islamic Republic, it has to be said. I mean, the Islamic Republic does a very good job in creating a sense of guilt among those of us in the West in order to hinder or prevent any form of action taking place. And I think it makes for very bad policy, I have to say, that people are hindered by an event that took place 75 years ago, when actually some of the things that the Iranian regime has done to its own people are by many levels worse than what happened in 1953.
Well, the prevailing narrative of the history around it has always been that the Shah was very unpopular. And as for me, anyway, someone who's not Iranian has started to look into this more and interview Iranians. Well, also anyone who's looking at this story can see that people are chanting for the Shah's heir, Reza Pahlavi. So how does that square with this narrative that the Shah was unpopular? Was he? And was he as awful as sometimes the prevailing narrative would have you believe?
Well, being unpopular and being awful are two different things. So, I mean, I think he did become quite unpopular at the end of the 1970s, certainly. what the Shah achieved on social and economic levels was quite unprecedented on the back of what his father had achieved in the early part of the 20th century. What the Shah failed to do quite catastrophically, as to be said, for him and for the country, was to provide a level of political reform to match the economic growth that was happening in the country. So, just to give you an example, you can't educate your public. You can't put hundreds of thousands of people through education and then through university and then tell them that they have to stay out of politics. I mean, it creates a problem, and I think that was the problem. So there were many things I think that the Shah did wrong. Whether he was a bad man or not is another matter. And I think when you then compare and contrast life in Iran under the Pahlavis and under the Shah, when Iran was by all accounts economically on the up, had very good relations with the outside world. I mean, what people normally contrast today, there are two things they take as a contrast. One is that the rial, the currency exchange in 1978 was 70 rials to the dollar. Okay, so it is now 1,470,000 rials to the dollar. So you just think about that. The other one that they all talk about is, of course, that if you had an Iranian passport in 1978, you could pretty much travel wherever you wanted, and now you can't go anywhere. I mean, it's an absolute disaster. It's almost a terrible indictment on the Islamic Republic after 47 years of revolution. That actually what people are engaged with now is Pahlavi nostalgia on an enormous scale, and people just look back to what happened. What they could see. It's very much a visual thing. What they could see in the 1970s, and they obviously sort of take away the fact that life for ordinary people was much better. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it was much better. And what they're seeing in Iran today is, an economic meltdown, as well as a political meltdown, but an economic meltdown that underpins it taking place in front of their eyes.
President Nixon said that he felt that the Shah was being unfairly judged. His model of governance was being compared to the best in the West. Whereas with the Iranian Islamic regime, we seem to be able to say, although that's just their culture, and we don't judge them the same way. Why do you think that is? And why do you think that sometimes in the West we struggle to judge Islamism in the way that maybe we should?
I think it's a fascinating question, and I think it's one that has puzzled many of us for a very long time. I think the Shah wanted to be held as part of the community of almost Western nations, and he was therefore judged by those standards. I think Nixon was right in many ways to say that, we were judging the Shah unfairly. He certainly wasn't in the same league as, say, Saddam Hussein or any of the Arab dictators in the region. Not a patch on it, to be honest, but yet we were much more critical of him. I can only put down really the level of, and this is what I've written about actually, the level of sort of, sympathy is too strong a term, but we are always seem to be willing to give the Islamic Republic the benefit of the doubt, is because many people digesting what you might call a sort of a sort of rather left-leaning reading of history tend to see the Shah as part of sort of imperialism in its broadest sort of stroke, and the Islamic Revolution as a sort of an anti-imperialist venture, and therefore they tend to give, and you see that at its more extreme versions, by the way, with the radical left today in the UK. But you have to remember, this is one of the things that always makes me sort of laugh is too strong a term, but at the time of the Islamic Revolution, there were fairly senior American officials describing Khamenei as the Gandhi of Iran. It's that absurd, and you have to. It's very, very interesting to see on the sort of what we might call the progressive wing of politics how people were willing to give Khamenei and the Islamic Revolution massive benefits of the doubt. Many of them regretted it afterwards, of course. Many of them regretted it, but some of them, alas, have not.
I think from documents that have been revealed since, there was this view that maybe he would moderate as he got into power. A lot of Iranians that I've spoken to in the last couple of weeks have revealed that the BBC is not very popular there. They feel that the BBC falls into this trap. Do you think that it's learned its lessons?
Which BBC are you talking about? BBC Persian or BBC the regular
Persian,
BBC?
but I suppose the organisation in general. Do you think that they've adequately covered the issues?
I think in fairness to the BBC, they have. I think a lot of there's a couple of things that's happened over the last couple of weeks. Basically, one is that Iranian protests tend to occur when the rest of us are on holiday, so that doesn't help. Two, I think, the absence of any journalists on the ground make it difficult. Three, there have been a number of protests in Iran, and I think, people were sort of deciding whether they should take this seriously or not. I think, after we were into a week of the protests, I think most of the news agencies have been pretty attentive, and I think there is now a rebound. So I think that there has been an element, I think, in the past of and I wouldn't criticize institutions per se. There's always the case that journalists will occasionally be a little bit more sympathetic than perhaps they should be, and sometimes that's because they're quite looking forward to a visa. I mean, they need to go now. I think fortunately now nobody's going to get a visa, so I don't think we need to make that compromise anymore.
And if we just bring it back to intervention, obviously, in the West we've been burned by some of the interventions that came about after 2001. And that kind of informs our attitude to them now.
Absolutely,
But a lot of Iranians feel as though at the time that the Shah fell, that actually if the US and the UK had tried to support him more, that maybe the whole Islamic regime would never have been able to take power. Do you think that there's credence to that?
And I think certainly at the time of the revolution, so the Shah himself said that the biggest problem he faced was mixed messaging from the Americans. And it's well known at the time, for instance, that the US ambassador in Iran basically went rogue. So he started talking to dissidents and the opposition when the official US government position was that they did not recognize them. So, of course, for the Shah, that was deeply problematic. I mean, I've written about this again, and I talk about this, that in the West, we have to be much more intelligent about the way in which we engage with this. We tend to paint far too broad brushstrokes in our in our level of engagement, going from one extreme to another. As I say, it's a choice between bombing the country or having tea with them or something. I mean, there are a whole sort of range of middle roads that you can take and median roads, and then there's all sorts of much more subtle approaches to the way you do things. I mean, even today in Iran, it's that level of public support, the ability to communicate. I mean, we should really be finding ways, to break the internet blackout, to make sure we get the news out, to shine a light on a lot of things that are going on. And I think at times, there's a degree in all, Western governments, in a sense, partly it's driven by guilt, partly it's driven by, inertia. And it's a pity, I think, sometimes that we don't engage enough and don't engage enough in our own interests. I mean, that's the key. There are key interests here that are actually hugely, if Iran does manage, I hope and pray eventually to get rid of the Islamic Republic and Iran becomes a, quote, normal country again, there are huge benefits for Western policy in the region. Huge. To say nothing of better relations.
What's your reading of Reza Pahlavi? Do you think he's a good figurehead for the protests?
I think Reza Pahlavi has a huge following in Iran. Okay, there's a huge nostalgia for the Pahlavis. I think, in my own mind, he needs to become more inclusive, and he needs to among his own followers as well, they need to become more inclusive, and he needs to be more explicit about the plans that he has in terms of, a constitutional settlement. There has to be a constitutional settlement. So there are more things that can be done. I think in many ways, he's also being carried by the sort of Pahlavi nostalgia that's taking place. But I don't think we should ignore the fact that there is an enormous amount of monarchical sort of sentiment in the country at the moment.
And just finally, we've started to see the counter-narrative forming, the idea that the protesters either don't exist, or they're Zionists, or they're terrorists, or they're Mossad agents. Yeah. And I'm starting to see that in the comments on my own videos. At first, there was a hell of a lot of support for the Iranians, and I'm starting to see that twist. And for the viewers watching now, how would you caution them to engage with the information that's coming out of Iran?
So certainly, the first thing I'd say to you is that we obviously are facing an internet blackout. We can't get the information out really from dissidents. So the information you're getting out now is in many ways very curated. The regime is determined to control the narrative. It's started to put out these narratives. I'm sure there are a lot of bots on various social media platforms that are repeating a lot of this information, a lot of these sort of narratives. Their main agenda is to sow doubt. It's a very Russian playbook, to sow doubt and to sort of claim that it's a sort of Mossad, CIA operation. I have to say, and I'll tell you this, and I think it's quite interesting that a lot of Iranians, obviously within or outside the country, do not buy this. They claim to have arrested 20,000 Mossad agents after the Iran-Israeli war. If there are still Mossad agents running around Iran, they haven't been doing a very good job. I mean, this is a, you know, they're coming out with some quite freakish arguments to claim that they have not been involved in the killing of protesters. Nobody buys it. And it's only, I'm sorry to say, the useful idiots abroad that are sort of basically showing a certain amount of reception to these arguments. You've got to be very, very careful.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.